Today I want to talk to you about kind of some of my most recent thoughts, building off previous research about how we recognize aspects of time within hoards. This idea that hoards are not the result of a single event, but of multiple events culminating in a hoard. I refer to these as accumulations over time. So I'm going to present to you today kind of the start of a framework towards this, which is very much a work in progress, and I'm very keen to hear the thoughts of everyone here today. To give some background, my interest in approaching time depth within hoards really started from these multi-period hoards that are now quite widely recognized across Bronze Age and Iron Age Britain. So here we have the Yatterdon hoard from Berkshire, which is at first glance your very typical late Bronze Age hoard containing a range of tools, weapons, bits of scrap metal, all very indicative of a 900 to 800 BC deposition. However, in amongst all of this, we have this complete and very nicely preserved early Bronze Age flat axe, which is perhaps the nicest, certainly the object in the best condition within the hoard, despite predating the hoard by over 1,000 years. And in addition to this, we have other objects that date to the Middle Bronze Age, predating the deposition of the hoard by about 400 years or so. And we know the rough date at which the hoard was deposited based off this proto-Sompting axe, which dates to around 800 BC. And it presents to us a huge amount of questions about how this hoard came together. In the case of the early Bronze Age axe, we're probably looking at a rediscovery of an earlier object that was incorporated into a later deposition. But perhaps with some of the Middle Bronze Age objects, are these objects that are retained over long periods of time? And how do we know that the rest of the objects in this hoard are indeed contemporary? How do we know which ones might be several decades old when they're deposited? There's all these questions that kind of set me on the path of thinking about recognizing time depth in hoards. And this very much builds on past research that's been undertaken, particularly in the last 10 to 15 years. You can turn to the work of people like David Fontaine, Stuart Needham, who have talked about these the potential of hoards as active deposits. The fact that we should be looking at hoards as something that were perhaps re-engaged with, reiterated, reopened, bits added, bits taken away over periods of time. And this may be over the course of days, months, perhaps even years. But archaeologically, those processes are often invisible to us because the resolution of the archaeological record doesn't allow for that sort of depth. But I think that there are ways to get at this in some cases. We also quite inspired by the work done by Duncan Garrow and Chris Gosden on Celtic art hoards, where they spoke very much of hoards as snapshots indicative of the networks that brought those groups of material together. Hoards speaking to the range of interactions and communications that people must have had to bring together such groups of metalwork. And this talk also builds on Jody Joy's proposition that we should be seeing hoards as collections. And he investigated this partly by looking at the various conditions of objects within a hoard, the state of repair, care, fragmentation that we can see within individual hoards. And alongside this, there's been an increased amount of work on what I term out of time objects, that is earlier objects showing up in later contexts. Richard Hingley did a fantastic paper in Proceedings of the Prehistoric Society on Bronze Age objects showing up in Iron Age context, and that has stimulated me to investigate this phenomenon further. And a shameless plug for a book that I co-edited and was published last year called Objects of the Past in the Past, which looks at this phenomenon throughout time, and that is open access and available on the ArchaeoPress website. As I said, this is very much kind of a starting point for me going in a new direction with this research. And so today I'm going to talk specifically about the tools that we can utilize as archaeologists to gain some nuance into time depth within a hoard. That means that I'm not going to focus so much on the broader context in which hoards were deposited, the landscape, such as the landscape, though of course these are incredibly important features. And none of the tools that I'm putting forward today will be unfamiliar to anyone. It's just about utilizing them in ways that we perhaps have either not done so or not done so in quite the extent to which I think we could be using them. We'll start with the fairly basic one of typology and relative dating, incredibly important for artifact studies in terms of structuring the material. We of course should be wary of not relying too much on this, but in the case of multi-period hoards, it offers us a very nice way of really identifying what is significantly earlier and what isn't. And perhaps the most famous multi-period hoard known to probably many of you here is the Netherhampton or Salisbury hoard of over 500 objects, deposited sometime in the Middle Iron Age, but comprising early, middle and late Bronze Age objects, as well as earliest, early and middle Iron Age objects. And this is part of a wider phenomenon that's been identified by Dr. Borton in the kind of Wessex, Wiltshire area. You see here the Vale of Wardour hoard, which suggests that in this region they were actively collecting and seeking out older objects. However, when we are less keen to utilize typology in this way when we have abutting typologies that either don't make sense to us as archaeologists or provide a little bit of uncertainty. So here is a hoard from Callendar in Stirling, which dates to the Middle to Late Bronze Age and has traditionally been considered a doubtful association, though there are relatively good records that it came in as a hoard. And the reason it's been considered doubtful is because it has a Late Bronze Age socketed axe alongside Middle Bronze Age rapiers and a spearhead. And when approaching hoards like this, we should be very aware that typologies are our own construction imposed on the past. We have rough ideas of when these objects were in use, but that does not exclude the fact that some objects may be in circulation for longer periods of time, or certain areas may have independently gained the technology for typologically later objects a little bit earlier. And of course, when we see the broad typologies of these objects, they abut each other, and to my mind, there's no reason why this couldn't represent objects that were in prolonged circulation into the Late Bronze Age, or the adoption of socketed axe a little bit earlier. Of course, ideally, we want to back up our typological ideas and relative dating with absolute dating. With hoards, this is relatively rare, but we've got some really stunning examples that do confirm that we do indeed have earlier typological objects alongside later depositions. I present here the lovely hoard from Balmacallan, Dumfries and Galloway in Scotland. One of the this is a lovely metalwork deposition in one of the bogs that Mel was waxing lyrically about yesterday, and this consists of a few decorative mounts and a mirror each wrapped in parcels of cloth and buried in a bog. The radiocarbon date from the cloth it came back with a Roman Iron Age date between the 1st and 4th centuries Cal AD, though the mirror style mounts, the mirror style decoration on the mounts is more consistent with a late 1st century BC, perhaps early 1st century AD date, and the mirror handle shows decoration reminiscent of Roman bronze vessels around the mid to late 1st century AD. And all credit to my colleague, Dr. Fraser Hunter, for explaining the nuances of decorative art styles in the late Iron Age. What we have here is a radiocarbon date that confirms that at least some of the objects were probably older when deposited. And if we were looking at this alongside a body in a grave pit, we would have no problems with suggesting that these might represent heirloom objects. We're certainly aware of the importance of mirrors at this time, and the careful wrapping and depositing of these objects suggests an aspect of curation. And we're, as I'll come back to, we're not quite so confident in discussing curation within hoards, but I think we definitely should be looking at it more. Radiocarbon dates are also insightful where we have multiple ones from the same site, and admittedly this is very rare, but one particularly famous site, we saw a little bit of it yesterday in Reb Ellis's talk, is the Llyncerrig Back hoard from Anglesey, and radiocarbon dates from this assemblage of Le 10 objects came back suggesting at least 2 depositional episodes, one in the conventional Middle Iron Age and the other at the beginning of the Roman period in the mid-1st century AD. And what this speaks to is where we have seemingly contemporary assemblages or assemblages that suggest revisitation. Sites like Llyncerrig Back certainly suggest that multiple depositional episodes are going on in a single place and building up this accumulation over time. And this really speaks to the importance of places and the idea of revisiting deposits and adding more over long periods of time, and this concept of social memory that must have persisted, knowing that in places, knowing in communities who knew that they needed to deposit metalwork in these areas. A less well-researched area, or rather a less exploited area of study in this regard, is metallurgy and material analyses. For a long time, we've been aware in the Bronze Age and Iron Age of broad trends in compositional properties that help us pick out anomalies. To take lead as an example, we know that lead is absent in early Bronze Age bronzes. It becomes a more regular addition in Middle to Late Bronze Age. There's little lead in Middle Iron Age bronzes, but by the 1st century AD, more lead and zinc is added again. These are very sweeping suggestions. They are not necessarily date stamps, but building on the work of people like David Dunworth and Peter Northover, recent studies by particularly the likes of Peter Bray and Mark Pollard looking at trace elements and isotopic analyses, I think this is really going to help nuance not only where metal is flowing and circulating at this time, but also we already have insights into some of the rough periods to which this metal might be coming from, particularly in terms of recycling, but also recognizing slightly older objects. A particularly clear example here is the Stoke Ferry hoard from Norfolk, which includes a copper halberd alongside a chalcolithic copper halberd alongside late Bronze Age objects. But the full potential of this has been really well shown by particularly the work of Mary Davis and her article with Adam Gwilt on the Seven Sisters hoard. I would encourage you all to read. The Seven Sisters hoard consists of 37 objects of various decorative styles, and what Mary and Adam's analysis of this hoard was able to show was that different styles and different types of objects could be linked to different alloys and different manufacturing techniques, which firstly suggests that this hoard was brought together across a range of communities, each contributing objects from their own decorative style. We may also be seeing different craftspeople, and this very much emphasizes what Garen Gosden have talked about in terms of hoards as snapshots of networks, and there are other Celtic art hoards that show similar sorts of ideas. One that comes to mind is the Polden Hill hoard from Somerset. And so we could be talking here about a communal offering, and we shouldn't, even if this wasn't gathered over a long period of time, the social organisation involved in bringing these objects together does take time. And in this way, we should also be viewing hoards in this way as well. And finally, a particularly useful insight is this idea of object histories. And by this, I'm referring to the various states of objects, as well as the structure within a hoard, the way objects have been produced, used, the state of wear, the state of fragmentation. Most recently, there's been quite a bit of work looking at repairs on Iron Age objects, and my fellow ECR, Helen Chittock, has done some really great work on that. But a lot of this has been undertaken in terms of graves and burials, and much like I've already mentioned with the Balmaclellan hoard, the state of fragmentation, the extensive wear of objects, when we see that in in burials, we tend to attribute that to a curated status, an heirloom status, and also explore some of the relational nature of these objects in relation to the place, other objects in the deposit, the person that they're buried with, appropriating theoretical frameworks such as object biography and assemblage theory. But what about when we see this in hoards? There's been far less work on the idea of assemblage within hoards, but even though we regularly record the same aspects of object histories. Here, for instance, I present the Late Bronze Age hoard from Sturgsey in Somerset. It's very much in keeping with Late Bronze Age fragmented hoards that you see across southern Britain. It consists of over 150 objects, and there's a range of complete and incomplete, used, unused, as cast, worn out, axes, spears, swords, ingots, metallurgical waste, and so on. And what this hoard suggests, I think, is the very active nature of this deposit. The idea that Stuart Needham put forward, where we have objects being added to and taking away from. I think this type of hoard really allows us some insights into that, because it has the new objects that must have been accumulated over time or contributed as fresh material into the system, but we also have fragments of various objects, and very few of which we fit, suggesting this turnover process. And most recently, the work by Rob Wiseman on statistical analyses of fragmented hoards suggests a very random process of accumulation. I would suggest that even if this process is random, the accumulation over time is particularly important to be aware of, because it suggests that people were aware of this deposit and adding and taking things away from it over time. And not going to go into it today, but the Sturgsey hoard also shows aspects of wider communal networks across Britain. And quite interestingly, a comparison of conditions within objects can give us some insights into how past societies thought about their past. So to return to multi-period hoards, here we have broadly Late Bronze Age hoard from Shoebury, consisting of worn and broken objects. The only complete object in the hoard is this Middle Bronze Age plough stave, which must have been 400 or 500 years older when deposited. I would presume that this is a rediscovered object that was incorporated into a later practice, but importantly, it wasn't treated in the same way as the later objects. So are we looking here at the incorporation and respect of older ideas, communities recognizing older inalienable objects? So thinking about hoards like this offers us some changing perspective on old questions, and also presents some new questions. Of course, what we want to get at is, why did people bury hoards? But by thinking of hoards as a process of accumulation, We can think about what role accumulation played in different societies. What was the significance of older objects when they were incorporated into these hoards? Were they simply worn out objects to be discarded, or did they hold some more individual significance? And by dealing with a long time frame like the late Bronze Age into the Iron Age, we can look at how this changed over time and space. And to pick up on some of the work that Mel was talking about yesterday, particularly the work of David Fontaine, we're increasingly aware that whilst there are broader concepts at play, the idea that you put metalwork into watery deposits or gather fragmented material into a dryland hoard, there is no one way to construct and bury a hoard, and it's a very individual process that's happening according to the landscape in which it's done, the available resources, and the feelings of individual communities. Is we can, as I've already mentioned, we can look at the idea of societies incorporating older ideas into new ones, which by extension relies on aspects of memory, building on what's come before, broader social concepts at play, but also relational ideologies. If we look at the late Iron Age, for instance, we know that this is a period of great change. What does that mean for hoarding, and what objects you choose to put in a hoard? Something like Seven Sisters perhaps speaks of a community coming together in a time of a slightly more disruptive time. We also have to distinguish between objects that are rediscovered and objects that are retained and curated. This is a highly contextualized situation, but whilst we can infer that rediscovery was probably opportunistic, although there are ways that one could go out and seek older objects. Barrows come to mind, pillaging barrows. This is probably something that just happened as and when, whereas the retention and curation of objects is a much more intimate, personal decision linked to people living at the time and the people who own the objects. And by bringing some of this together, along with the object histories and the various structure of the hoard, we can think about the very performative aspects of hoarding, throwing things in bogs, wrapping things, carefully structuring them. And I'm quite conscious I'm in my final couple of minutes. So I will very quickly run through a case study which I think brings together a lot of these ideas. This is a hoard from Poole in northwest Scotland. And this is something I've been working on with Dr. Dot Orton. And I think it's a broadly contemporary assemblage of objects. It's got a depositional date around 800 BC, and it's generally been treated as a single collection of contemporary objects. However, Orton's work on earliest Iron Age socketed axes shows that these Sompting type axes provide a typological date of deposition around 800 to 600 BC. We've been very lucky with this hoard in that there is a piece of wood preserved in one of these axes, which gives us the first date for a hoard of this period, falling within the first half of the 8th century BC. However, when we delve into this hoard a little bit further, there is also a late Bronze Age form of object, this cup-ended ornament, which dates more conventionally to the preceding 200 years. And it's a very unusual object and shows signs of where we may speculate that this is an older object, perhaps an heirloom object that could be anything between a couple of decades and up over 100 years old when deposited. And whilst the axes I've mentioned so far were left complete, it's also telling that we have an incomplete, deliberately fragmented axe head here, a practice that's very much more common in the late Bronze Age. It's much more common in the earliest Iron Age to leave axes complete when deposited. And so here we have a mixture of practices that seem to be going on, as well as slightly older objects. And Peter Northover has undertaken metallurgical analysis of this hoard, indicating that 5 pools of metal were used as indicated by various trace elements and impurity patterns. What this basically means is that this is not a homogenized collection of metalwork. This was not all produced from one pool undertaken by one craftsperson. This is a collection of objects, some of which were clearly old, some of which incorporated older practices, alongside newer ways of treating objects, newer objects that were entering the system. And all of this, I should say, was deposited in a bog. So again, we've got this significance of bogs coming to the forefront. And I think by this is just a loose example that shows how bringing all these tools together can really add nuance to our study of hoards. And as I say, this is just very much work in progress. But I think thinking about these groups as accumulations over a period of time can add real nuance to what we can say about communities living in the Bronze Age and Iron Age. And on that note, I'd like to again thank the IARSS committee for putting together a fantastic conference, for inviting me to speak, and also acknowledge the various people who have helped with the work on this. If you wish to ask me any questions after the conference, please feel free to tweet me or drop me an email.